Okay, everybody, welcome back. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is our Braincast number 13, and joining us today is Dr. Drew Edwards, my business partner in the Neurogenesis project, and I'm Dr. Sean Orr. Drew, it's good to see you back.
Good to see you. Always a pleasure, my friend.
Thank you. Likewise, we thought we would come in today and just hit one of the topics that we got a lot of interesting feedback about during our last Braincast, which was the subject of the tragic murder of Rob Reiner and his wife by their son Nick.
Yes.
And since you're a forensics expert and neuroscientist who has advised the courts in cases where there are people who are struggling with addiction, I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about your thoughts on the case, and maybe a larger topic we could talk about would be how addiction modifies the brain, and maybe how we can help people to correct that problem over time in our clinic. So what are your thoughts
Yeah.
about the updates and
But
such?
it's certainly a tragedy, and it's been politicized, unfortunately. Um, and and you were telling me his lawyer. I think you had a quote. His lawyer said he's going to plead not guilty. I think that's it. Right?
I
Correct.
think actually the lawyer seems like he's backed out of the case, but in
Okay.
the process of doing so said that Nick is not guilty of murder. And that
Okay.
sounds like a loaded statement to me. I don't know what that means, but there's a lot
When
to
I get
think
in
about there.
Florida, when I get called in for a case, it's in the penalty phase, meaning
Mm.
the individual has been convicted of first degree murder. And in Florida, the decision then is life in prison without any chance of parole or death. And my job at that point is to explain what happens to the brain when someone's been addicted, abused, traumatized, and cumulatively, what did that have to do with the commission of felony murder? And there's hundreds of variables that go into that, and I spend a lot of time reading everything, and spend probably in hours. I probably spent 12 hours interviewing and talking with um, man convicted in death row. I'm sitting in the cell with this guy, and
Mm.
it was daunting at first, but I think it's important that people understand that you just the damage that drugs and alcohol and intoxicants do to your thinking and even your brain
Mhm.
structure. Most of the public can say knows the word dopamine, and dopamine has been thrown around that cause of everything. We got to get dopamine, 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 dopamine.
Mhm.
And people don't fully understand that it isn't just dopamine. Dopamine is critically important to our well-being, and it is part of our reward system, but there's a lot other parts to our reward system as well. And you, as a interventional neurologist, you see the brain in a way that's different than most addiction doctors and most psychiatrists. You have a take on it that's very unique to the way I was trained, and that's I think why what we are doing in the Neurogenesis project is so novel, and and why we're having such good results. The quick answer is we treat the brain first, and realize asking someone to function normally, even several months after they've quit using, is like asking someone to run a mile competitively with a torn hamstring. They can't
Mhm.
do it. It isn't
Yeah.
that they don't want to do it, they just can't do it. We can't see how the brain is injured. We can see a torn hamstring. You can't see the brain is limping along and burning up all kinds of energy just trying to get out of bed every day and get motivated. As I so The final question when I'm testifying, and you understand that the state attorney is just ripping me, trying to find all kinds of reasons why I don't have a position on the death penalty. I trust the system. The jury of our peers makes that the decision. They hear both the mitigating factors, what went into this that should result in some leniency in the penalty, or what aggravated this. If it was just a heinous type of thing, that's got to be considered as well. And the jury does that. And we just have to trust the system. And you and I were involved with a case. It was a friend of yours, so they wouldn't let you in, but we got very involved in the research on this, and it was fascinating, isn't it?
Well,
to
it
see
is.
how
And,
others work.
it's so much of this goes down to decision making and judgment. The determination of the difference between right and wrong, abstraction, and really these are all frontal lobe functions, if we think about it, informed, of course, by our emotions and driven by our emotions, which are very powerful. So when we saw this case update, and I think one of the reasons why this has been maybe a hot topic for us is because of the addiction component, and there's a lot of opinions out there about what addiction means and what it does to your behavior. And of course, everything we're saying here is speculation. We don't know the ins and outs of the case. We can only hypothesize about what's really going on. But
That's right.
I'm just thinking from your experience here, if Nick Reiner's lawyer has backed out of the case and he's saying that Mr. Reiner is not guilty of murder, but that just opens up all sorts of other questions. Then does that mean that he was not mentally competent? Was he criminally insane at the time? How do you process that when you're going through your thinking process? What comes to mind if he's not guilty of murder according to his attorney? Of course, he's going to be arguing that, but then he's also excusing himself from the case.
Yeah, the distinction is he not guilty because he actually didn't do it and someone else did it? That I don't think he's saying that, but it's a possibility with that statement. It is the idea of what we used to call the temporary insanity plea, or insanity. They weren't capable of understanding right from wrong, and that's how that works. Just as a sidebar, my great uncle was the first man ever acquitted on the grounds of temporary insanity. He was a U.S. congressman named Dan Sickles, fought in the Civil War. His wife was having an affair with the man who, the Keys, the guy who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. He was having an affair with his son.
Oh,
And he
really?
saw the son out in Washington Square across the street and went out with a pistol and executed him.
Oh my
And he
gosh.
was exonerated on the grounds of temporary insanity. He went on to marry the Queen of Spain, and
Oh, wow.
he got it. His leg was in the Smithsonian Institute. He was shot off in Gettysburg. Little sidebar, but yeah,
Interesting.
I'm
What a
related to.
character.
My grandfather said he was a scoundrel and a horse thief. So who knows, right? But anyway, so that has been used many times. How I deal with that is I know that drugs and being intoxicated impairs the frontal brain. And the frontal brain is the last part of our brain that develops in human beings. We start at the back with the things that control breathing and heart rate and such, and all the way to the front. And you've been very helpful in helping our patients understand that the frontal brain is where we decide what's right and wrong. It's where we can inhibit those more hedonic mammalian brain that wants to eat, procreate, copulate. It wants to hydrate, and it wants to fight or flee. Those are the basic survival functions. And it's our frontal brain in humans that actually makes us human, where we can have a desire to do something that it would be immoral or socially inappropriate, but our frontal brain says, I'm not doing that. I want to, but it wouldn't be socially acceptable. Besides, there's cameras everywhere. I might get caught. But when you're intoxicated, the first part of your brain that goes to sleep is the frontal brain. That's why if you see the old put the lampshade on the head kind of story we used to see, no one does that sober. A sane person doesn't do that sober. but you're not drunk or intoxicated all the time. And people say, well, if you're not drunk at the moment, then how can that be a defense? So I'd like to talk for a moment about what addiction to drugs and alcohol do to the frontal brain and why that doesn't heal properly. And we could talk about the salience network I'd like to include in that. And there's all kinds of variabilities, but there's the alleles and the single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are genetic kinds of things that change the way our cells and DNA is transcribed. So why don't we talk about the chronicity of addiction and toxicity?
That sounds like a good idea. I think that when you're talking about chronicity, you're talking about the exposure over time to a toxin, and there's a dose and time factor there, right?
Yes.
So neurotoxins, affect the brain differently in different people. Some people seem to have an amazing resilience and able to shrug it off. Other people are very vulnerable for a variety of reasons. I think you and I were talking about a case where I was reviewing the situation where the patient was diagnosed with supranuclear palsy, progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP. It's a neurodegenerative disorder that is it's a form of Parkinsonism, if you will, and people who are affected with this develop difficulty with speech and with their coordination and their gait. And one of the characteristic findings in these folks is that they have a hard time with looking up and down, what we call vertical gaze. And reviewing the literature, it was interesting to see that the pathophysiology of PSP is really a spreading effect of dysfunction across the base of the brain and into the brainstem. And so there's an accumulation of the tau protein, which is one of the important proteins that helps to create scaffolding for neurons. And as the dysfunction of those tau proteins spreads throughout the base of the brain, the pathology gets worse. So there is a chronicity there as well, right? Over time, you see a decrease in function as this pathology spreads and energy of the brain starts to fail. When we look at somebody who has chronic, let's say, alcohol addiction and substance use disorder, again, you're looking at that different kind of neural damage, right? But induced by a toxin rather than a failure of brain energy. But there's a lot of overlap. There seems to be a lot of similarity between the two.
There's also I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, when you're evaluating somebody who's, let's say, on death row and they've made these poor decisions that got them into a place where they actually could take somebody else's life, do you see, is there any trends that you've observed over the years where in terms of how much time and how many doses they've used makes a bigger impact?
Yeah. And the drug that they've used. I'll give you one example. Smoking marijuana for most people doesn't make them aggressive and violent. It makes them passive. So passive they don't do anything, right? It's when when they need more, that's when they're agitated. Same with, when you're using cocaine, I probably half of the cases were cocaine or crack addiction. And when crack addicts are high, they're not dangerous, they're happy. It's the only time they're happy. And we'll talk about what happens to the neurotransmitters when you use cocaine. It's when they stop and can't get any more is when they commit the crime. They go try to rob somebody or steal from somebody and get something to sell or get money so they can buy more crack. And that's when they're dangerous. So, but every case is different. Alcohol, alcohol, when you're addicted to alcohol, which is what did you describe it as? A highly volatile hydrocarbon?
Volatile hydrocarbon, yeah. You like to call it a solvent. So.
A solvent, yeah. Think of living tissue and you put it in a solvent, what's going to happen? brain. And in chronic alcoholics, we used to see, we called it wet brain. Remember that term?
I do,
And
yeah.
we used to think they had too much spinal fluid. They didn't. They had too little brain. Alcohol
Yep.
actually dehydrated and shrunk their brain. And it caused cognitive deficits to the point where you were like talking to a fifth grader. They were that damaged. So there's also things that I wish they would drug test these people when they arrest them. They never do. And I always wanted to get genetic testing. So we know some of the things that are associated with addiction that isn't anybody's fault, like the COMT gene. We found that out, and the DRD2 dopamine receptor, D2 dopamine receptor, and the TAQ1A allele. You want to talk a little bit about those things and why that makes people vulnerable?
Sure. There's this notion that different people exist along a spectrum based on how much dopamine they actually contain in their brain. Some people are fast metabolizers and some people are slow metabolizers, right? So if
Right.
somebody is a fast metabolizer because their COMT gene makes them a fast metabolizer, then they're naturally predisposed to chew through their dopamine too quickly, leaving them feeling less focused, more the
Hyper.
attention deficient, hyper, right? And now when it comes to going to battle, those folks tend to be extremely effective and they can step up to the plate. But on the other side of the spectrum, somebody who has an excessive amount of dopamine might be seen as being somewhat neurotic or even prone to paranoia or even hallucinations and frank
Yeah,
psychosis. So there's a spectrum there. Um, I wondered, have you seen anybody in your career who's been hypodopaminergic and then ends up getting treated and gets too much dopamine and ends up
sure,
psychotic? Have you
sure.
seen those in the
Yeah.
criminal justice system or?
Not specifically there, but in my time at the
Mhm,
when I was at the University of Florida, and I was also on faculty at Medical College of Georgia, where we had a locked psychiatric unit.
mhm,
And I saw that a lot, where people were becoming psychotic, and some of them had schizophrenia, was poorly managed, and that's dopaminergic to a great degree. But yes, that can happen. But what we see mostly with addiction is dopamine depletion. And there's been a lot of work by Ken Bloom, who I've
mhm,
talked to you about, who really began to describe what he calls and what we're beginning to call addiction is reward deficiency syndrome.
mhm,
To your point, in fast metabolizers mean they've got to replenish their dopamine. Well, now 100 years ago, there wasn't too much excitement. You couldn't go find a quick fix to get a dopamine rush. Now you just pick up your cell phone,
mhm,
or you play a video game, or you gamble on
mhm,
sports. That's a huge dopamine rush. One of the things that is more powerful than actually the drug is the anticipatory reward in terms of dopamine.
mhm,
Dopamine rushes up in anticipation of reward. And so it'd be like being hungry and you walk into home and you smell turkey cooking in the oven. Your mouth starts watering. You haven't seen the turkey, but
mhm,
you're anticipating the reward.
mhm,
Pavlov proved that with his dog, right, 100 some
mhm.
years ago.
That's right.
So when it comes to crime, it's when they're on the way up or on the way down that they become agitated and prone to violence. Again, we don't know the specifics of Nick Reiner. We do know he'd been in treatment, I think 12 times, something like that,
Mhm,
which is just a crime that he didn't get well or didn't get the right treatment. Um, Rob Reiner, I don't know much about him, but I knew he was a good man. I knew he loved his family and he gave a lot of his time and money to help people. He was that kind of guy. And
mhm,
in the interviews, I looked, show him and his son together because his son had said he was detached from his father and almost described his dad as not being interested in him. And they did a little movie about this and they discussed it. And Rob, to his credit, was taking the blame. And as you listen to it, it wasn't really all on him. He
Mm-hmm.
tried. He can't just blame your parents for everything that you're unhappy about in life. And I
Mm-hmm.
think part of what was going on was that. So the question is, this is a guy who was really high functioning, sober, and then out of nowhere, he goes to a party, comes home, and they find his parents dead the next day. And I get these cases, and they don't always tell me the truth, but I would say 8 out of 10 of the people I've worked with have told me the truth, what they did. And usually, again, it's in the commission of trying to get money. The other thing is that they get into an argument or some altercation. Now, normally the frontal brain inhibits you from getting violent, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're intoxicated, that's why there's so many fights in bars.
Mm.
You want to go watch a good fight, you don't need pay-per-view. Go to a bar,
That's
you know.
right.
And
Yeah.
a fight's going to break out around the pool table more often than not.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't have inhibitory control. So he may have been angry about something, but he wasn't able to suppress it. And you think of the violent fantasies we each have. Driving down 95 and people cut you off. If I was convicted of a crime for the fantasies of violence I have at the moment, I'd be in
Mm-hmm.
jail forever. But
Mm-hmm.
I want to do something, but my frontal brain says, no, don't do that. Don't go down to that level. And an addict cannot do that. Their brain is damaged to that point where that inhibitory control and the salience network are not online, as to steal one of your terms. So when the frontal brain goes offline, Doctor, regardless of the reason, what happens?
So, the frontal lobes they act as a bit of a filter for emotions. It helps to modulate our emotions, right? And you've mentioned the salience network a number of times. There's this really interesting grouping of neurons that is constantly active in the background, trying to assess the importance of things that are occurring in our environment. I think a lot of people we talk to are familiar with the idea of the amygdala. Many people have heard it just like they've heard about dopamine, and they associate the amygdala with the fight or flight response or with anxiety. But really,
Mm-hmm.
what the amygdala is responsible for doing is detecting differences in our environment. So you could be walking in the woods, and if you see the brush is rustling, you don't know what that is, but your amygdala is detecting that difference, right? It's something that's happening, and your brain has learned to be uh, aware for those threats, and the amygdala simply sends the information up to the salience network for decision making. Is this a threat? Is it a friend or foe? We're
Mm-hmm.
going to generally default to threat until we have proof to the contrary, right? Especially if we're in a threatening environment like the ocean or the woods or a
Mm-hmm.
swamp, or in the middle of a riot. There are all sorts of urban, scenarios, and we're seeing this popping up all over the globe right now, where people are experiencing heightened sensitivity to their environments because of potential threats.
Hypervigilance, really, in a
Yeah,
certain environments where you're,
yeah.
and drug addicts do that a lot. Cocaine addicts become hypervigilant, paranoid, actually, because of an
Yeah.
overworking of that system.
Well, I honestly think we're starting to see that in our clinical setting here too. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like the dial has been turned up, the amount of tension that's out there now because of uh, the rumblings about upcoming World War III, upcoming Civil War, what's going on with Minneapolis, in Minnesota. There's all of these inputs that are kind of turning up the heat for everybody. But the salience network is the one that gets to really kind of discriminate and determine, is this really a threat or not? And that sits up higher in our frontal lobes, and it really makes some important decisions quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and based on our experiences, of course, that shape our thought process. But the tricky part with the salience network is that when you get up into the frontal lobes, there are some very expensive neurons, very demanding brain cells called the von Economo neurons.
Mm-hmm.
They're also known as spindle cells. But the von Economo neurons are they're very large and they take in a lot of information from different regions of the brain to process the importance of an event. You probably have seen people, we have all experienced people in our lives who seem to overreact to the smallest thing, even things that aren't threats.
Sure.
They may have post-traumatic stress disorder. They may have had traumatic experiences in the past that have informed their salience network that this is something that I need to pay attention to. So they may have a heightened over the top response.
PTSD is the ultimate form of that, where you're
Yeah,
triggered by a non-threatening something that reminds you of a threatening thing, and you feel like
yeah,
it's happening exactly how it happened 20 years ago or whenever the event was,
that's right.
because of that. Because of that.
That's right. And you know, you and I talk a lot with our patients and clients about the locus of control, right?
Mhm.
Are you in charge of what happens to you, or is what happens in your external world going to dictate the way that you behave, right? And when we have a very robust, healthy salience network and we've practiced emotional control over the years, which of course does involve suppressing impulsive responses that are dopamine driven, the more we practice that emotional restraint and emotional control, the better we get at it because of neuroplasticity. But you know, it's not uncommon for us to see somebody in clinic who has been through rehab a number of times, which is one of the reasons why I think Nick Reiner's case is so interesting to us. And they really haven't been transformed by the process because as much practice as they might be getting on emotional restraint, there are other aspects of brain health that have not been addressed. In other words,
Yeah.
are what has been done to improve the internal environment of the brain so that those very sensitive von Economo neurons can work right. And
I think
so,
a great example of practicing, as like we tell alcoholics, probably don't get a job in a bar. Why?
hmm
It's a job. Well, because you're seeing the alcohol and you're recalling. Euphoric recall is also part of the salience
hmm
network in a positive way, that just like a stick may look like a snake temporarily and I may startle,
hmm
seeing alcohol reminds me, God, I had a lot of fun last time I drank
hmm
that brand.
hmm
So there are triggering events for people in recovery. So the advice is stay away from them. That's why we need like AA and friends who know this and will
hmm
check in with you, because your impulse control is not working well. And you should call them and say, I really want to get drunk right now. And because many people do for a couple months. But if you call someone and talk about it, you go from that emotional to the brain, and that you engage the frontal brain. And I've heard you explain that to people frequently. We treat a lot of addicts in our clinic, obviously.
hmm
The other thing I want to comment on is why do they do this? Why? And it has, you mentioned the amygdala and the inner brain and survival. So the behaviors that we're seeing in addiction are the same. It's the same mechanism that we used to survive 800 years ago, where
hmm
we needed food and water every day. How did you go out to lunch 800 years ago? We had to go out and kill something, gut it, drag it home, pick up some vegetables on the way, right?
hmm
Walk a mile to the stream, get some water. It was a workout just to live one day. So
hmm
the salience network and the whole reward system rewards us when we get it right, because I'm going to eat tonight. Or we build
hmm
a shelter that's rewarding because I'm being protected. Um, we need we want to have more children to work the farm, so I've got a very good procreation drive, a sex drive, one of the strongest drives we have, all filtered through the frontal brain. And addicts have damaged their frontal brain. And we talk about the wiring, the connections are there, but the light bulb's very dim. And we see that on the MRIs when we look at the DIT images. Why don't you comment on that?
Sure. So you're referring to diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI, which is a modality. We now can actually look at brain structure and function in ways that we never could have before. It's a very exciting time to be in the neurosciences, because we have a lot of insight that we never
Good
had
time to be an
before.
addict. If you're going to be one,
It's
it'd be good now. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. From that perspective, there are
Yes.
more therapeutic options, and we'll go through some of that in just a bit. But I think half the battle is just making the diagnosis. It's how often have we seen a family who brings in their loved one, the addicted patient, who is there kind of kicking and screaming almost against their will. They're being, coerced by loving family to do this one last clinic visit, and then we're able to show them, objectively speaking, with neuroimaging, where the areas of damage are. Here's an area of your brain that seems to be turned down or turned off in terms of its, ability to actually connect with other neurons. We teach our families about this idea of anosognosia, which is a blindness to their own blind spots, right? Which is different from the psychiatric principle of denial, where
Hmm.
denial is maybe more of an emotional coping mechanism to deal with a very intense emotion that just is too hard to deal with at the time.
Yeah.
With
Guilt and shame.
anosognosia, with yeah, with anosognosia, you're dealing with an actual structural neurobiological problem that's creating a cognitive defect or cognitive bias, where a person's really just not able to see that they have a problem. This is one of the
Yeah.
reasons why I think the part of the brilliance of Alcoholics Anonymous is standing up and saying your name and admitting that you have a problem.
Yes.
If you can't start with that, then there are too many other obstacles to overcome. So admitting that there's a problem now, maybe, how deep does it go? How has it affected the rest of our family, et cetera? That's maybe where sometimes denial starts to come in play, because as somebody's brain gets healthier and they start to become more self-aware, they also become more self-aware of the damage they've caused. And that can be really hard to come to grips with, right?
The other scenario we see is someone comes in and the family or someone says, well, he's just anxious and he's depressed. His moods are all over the place. And he's been diagnosed with bipolar, has been on these meds and nothing happened. And then what I automatically think they're using drugs. I mean, addiction looks a lot like bipolar. You have extreme mood swings. When you got the drugs and you're high, you're in a good mood. When you're not, you're in a horrible mood, and you can get violent and agitated and say things you wish you hadn't have said. And that happens. That's typical. Where there's an addict in the home, you see all this tension and fighting and not unhappiness. So we ask the person. We have the one patient we always talk about. After 2 hours of watching him sort of drool and stumble on his words and blaming his ex and all that, I said, by the way, do you smoke marijuana? Oh, not that much. How often? Oh, only 3 times a day.
Right.
In his world, that wasn't much.
Yeah.
And he's gone on to start Marijuana Anonymous meetings in the North Florida area. So but that happens a lot. And the family doesn't see the addiction either, because it's not something they talk about. Son, why you seem so moody and unhappy today? He knows that, Dad, I can't get cocaine today and I'm in a bad mood. He'll say my teachers hate me, or something, something else is causing this, not a substance. And we see that frequently. They used to say there are no volunteers in treatment, meaning in the throes of addiction, where your life's coming apart, no one ever wakes up one morning and says, I think I'll go to treatment today. There's some crisis in their life that makes that the only door that's remaining open for them. And it's a good thing if they live through that and they can actually get to that crisis that gets them help. We want that. And sometimes we have to urge the family to make an artificial crisis, to quit enabling them. But yes, they come into us because they don't understand what that is, we call it, addiction is a brain disease. It's brain failure. So is depression, anxiety, trauma, all those cause parts of the brain not to function as they were designed to function. And putting a solvent or an intoxicant in your brain repeatedly is going to damage your brain.
It is, and I so when I would see patients in the hospital with closed head injuries or strokes,
Stroke, yeah.
my typical timeline for healing was about a 3-year horizon. And I would tell my patients, and I still do, that you'll probably have about half of your healing in the first 6 months. The other half is going to take another 2.5 years, and at that point you'll probably plateau,
That's the
right?
same with
So,
addiction,
so
pretty much. Yeah.
so well, it totally makes sense, right? I mean,
Yeah.
for us to expect somebody to be completely back to normal after being sober for a month is really unrealistic. They have a long road ahead of them of healing from the damage, right? So we're dealing with demyelination, which is stripping off of the insulating covering of neurons. We're dealing with neuronal injury, right? The actual cell bodies have been injured. We're dealing with a metabolic crisis because the mitochondria in the neurons have been so overtaxed by trying to process all of these toxins that there's an energy deficit in the brain. We're dealing with a chronic inflammatory process because the microglia, which are supporting cells in the brain, have been damaged themselves and have been working overtime to clear out metabolic toxins and byproducts. Not to mention the accumulation of cellular components that come from when cells actually die. We're
Right.
dealing with nutritional deficiencies because when somebody's been drinking very hard, they neglect themselves and they become deficient in things like thiamine and vitamin B12, niacin, um, lithium, the actual components of cellular membranes. So choline becomes deficient. And
Right.
there was a really, really interesting study that was just published looking at people who have anxiety. So not necessarily associated with drug use, but just people with anxiety in general have a greater risk of being deficient of choline in their
Yeah.
brains. And choline forms the cellular membranes, but it also forms acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that's very important for storing and retrieving memories from the hippocampus and other parts of the brain. And so choline deficiency seems to provoke or be involved somehow in anxiety. And I think a lot of our patients that we've seen who drink will drink to relieve anxiety, and
Yeah.
it's a vicious cycle, right? So really, there are multiple facets here, multiple mechanisms of action where long-term drug and alcohol use will damage the organ and cause brain failure. And we're really trying hard to popularize that term, brain failure, because you
Yes.
can see the light bulb go on in the family members when we talk about
Right.
this.
And we have heart failure and kidney failure and
Sure.
all kinds of, but we'd never say brain failure. And
Yeah.
I think part of it, as I've talked about, we haven't been able to image it very well
Hmm.
for only the last 30 years, I would think.
Hmm.
And we probably know almost everything there is to know about how the kidney and the heart work. We don't
Hmm.
know much about the brain,
We're
as
still
I
learning
call
a
it,
lot.
the final frontier of human anatomy is the brain, which
Hmm.
is the most important organ we have. Um, I mean, you could have a body; it's all working great. If your brain's not working, you have no quality of life, right? So, but
You
yeah,
know,
so addicts have they talk about in AA they've been talking about this since 1935, a free floating anxiety. That's what they talk about. They're describing just what you said. They didn't know what to call it. They didn't
hmm
know their acetylcholine was deficit, and which brings us in a minute to how we treat some of these things in our clinic. But anxiety just runs parallel with alcoholism and most other addictions as well. They're just
hmm
anxious people, and we call Xanax freeze dried alcohol because
hmm
it's a sedative hypnotic drug, right? You just drink this, take a Xanax. They do essentially the same thing. The Xanax won't dehydrate you, but it's pretty similar. And they numb out the anxiety. And when you drink or smoke weed, you get a couple-hour vacation from whatever's stressing you out. That's why they don't call it normal hour after work. They call it happy hour. You have a
That's
couple
right.
of drinks, your stress level will drop.
Hmm.
But if you drive home, get a DUI, your stress level is going to go up significantly, which unfortunately is usually the consequence. If you took 1,000 people, went to happy hour, 4 nights a week, a lot of them would get into trouble from doing that. And so the addicts, their denial or anosognosia is real. They don't see it the way we see it. We see them and they just look like, what are you talking about? I don't do that. For family members or friends, whenever someone says something like, I don't drink more than anybody else, that's all the diagnosis I need, because yeah, you do drink more than somebody, right? So those are the kind of statements we see that are part of the rigid defense system that all addicts have. They're rigidly defended. Why? Think of survival again. If I couldn't get food or water, I gotta find it. I'm scared. My anxiety's up. I am stressed. Addiction usurps that reward system. You can desire the intoxicant the same way a starving man desires food. That system is hijacked, usurped, and it's not real. They think they're starving to death. They're not. They're anxious about it. That's what anxiety is, an irrational fear. But that's what they're dealing with. But to them, it no longer seems irrational. It doesn't.
Maybe that's a good segue into some of the newer therapies that we're using in clinic for our patients who are struggling with addiction. I really like what you just said, and I've heard you say it many times that you know the reward system is being usurped, and when it comes to hunger and cravings, this is where I think it's been really interesting as a clinician to see how the newer class of weight loss drugs are affecting cognition.
Yes.
And I put that in quotes. So we're talking about the GLP-1 receptor activators, things like Ozempic, which is semaglutide, or tirzepatide, which is also known as Zepbound or Wegovy. These are medicines that are extremely popular and blockbuster drugs, right? And they're being marketed to the general public as weight loss drugs, which they do cause weight loss, and probably better than anything that we've ever used before. I personally had a lot of resistance to even learning about these medications when they first came out, just because I was seeing so much quick fix stuff happening in the marketplace, and it felt to me like I wasn't sure that I wanted to be involved in that. But as I studied them, I realized that I was being foolish, because these medications actually really are brain modulating medications, and I would argue they actually heal brain tissue and coax brain tissue to work more normally. And a
Talk about how
really
they do that. That's
well, a
important.
really beneficial side effect of that is weight loss, right? So if you think about the GLP-1 receptor, so this is a receptor that helps to reduce hunger and appetite for food.
Glucagon-like receptor. Yeah.
A glucagon-like receptor, right? And so a glucagon-like peptide
Peptide.
1.
Yeah.
And so these receptors are found in abundance in the lateral hypothalamus. This is an area right at the center of the brain, towards the front, that is the hypothalamus is your master regulatory center. So
A thermostat almost.
your
Yeah.
thermostat, your
Yeah.
temperature, your appetite, your hunger, your circadian rhythms, right? All of this is started in the hypothalamus, which gathers information from the whole brain to make decisions about what's needed.
Right
There's
next to the amygdala. Yeah.
well, it's kind of central to the amygdala, yeah, but there is communication to the amygdala as well. The hypothalamus oftentimes gets damaged in people with metabolic syndrome. So if you think about the connection between the hypothalamus and the adipose tissue, there are signaling hormones, ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin is always being secreted in the background by adipose tissue fat, and it stimulates appetite, and it does that constantly. And when we eat a meal, our adipose tissue now sends out leptin, which travels to the brain, to the lateral hypothalamus, and it activates these receptors to turn off the hunger switch, if you will.
We're born hungry. I want to
But
bring it back to survival
sure.
drive because we are born hungry. That's our
Hmm.
baseline. And
Yep.
so ghrelin is because for most of human history, people died of starvation.
Hmm.
We die of obesity now. We're this
Hmm.
abnormality era. But up
Hmm.
until just 100 years ago, and it's in many countries today, people still die of starvation. So
Hmm.
food is super salient.
Hmm.
And so ghrelin is you got to eat.
Hmm.
And
And
yeah,
so, in the case of overabundance of calories, now what we're doing is we're constantly secreting leptin in larger and larger quantities, and the lateral hypothalamus gets inundated with all of this leptin and overdrives it to the point where the normal machinery inside those neurons, called the endoplasmic reticulum, gets burned out. So we call that
consistent.
endoplasmic reticular fatigue. And when they fatigue, now they can no longer synthesize the proteins that send downstream messages to shut down appetite. And now we have a failure of the appetite regulatory system.
It's kind of leptin resistance, right? I mean,
That's
it's
exactly
like,
it, leptin
yeah,
resistance, yeah. And that's one aspect of obesity. I mean, there are other, other components as well, but that's a powerful one. And what we're finding with medications like semaglutide and tirzepatide is that they stimulate the GLP-1 receptor really well in a way that actually helps to improve satiety and turns down those downstream secondary
mhm,
actions that result in thoughts of food. So this has been such an interesting thing to observe where patients who are placed on these medications feel a great sense of relief often, right? That for the first time in a long time, they're not plagued by constant thoughts of what is it that they need to eat next,
right.
those food thoughts. And what's so interesting is I don't know many patients who actually even knew what food thoughts were before this came out, right? They just had it as a constant chatter in the background, and it was like the water that a fish swims in.
Yeah.
So now you turn down that signaling, and a lot of our patients are feeling liberated. They feel free finally from that sense of chatter about what are they going to eat next
But
and
our
that drive.
default, given what I said about hunger and starvation, our
Hmm.
default system is food, eat it.
Yeah.
And we now live in a world where you don't have to go out and spend a lot of energy finding
Hmm.
it. You people are, people are overweight because food is everywhere.
Yeah.
You can't go into an office. You can't go into your car. You can't go to a soccer game. Parents bring three lunches and
Hmm.
big gulps, and we just have food around us constantly, and that is such an abnormal thing in human history. So yes,
It
it's
is,
hard.
and it is, and it would be very easy to just distill this down to a willpower issue, right? Just stop eating. But I think it goes back to the same kind of issue as somebody who's been drinking for a long time, right? Their willpower circuitry has been burned out and damaged. And so now they're just cruising on empty when it comes to willpower and following their urges, their drives. So what we're seeing in clinic now is when we take on a patient who has chronic alcohol use, right, and they've maybe they've been through rehab one or two, three times, and they're still not better. Maybe they're compliant. You really helped me to understand this. You know, the difference between compliance and sobriety. They haven't achieved a sober mindset yet. They're just complying because everybody's forcing them to.
Yeah.
And they can be pretty resentful and angry and blame casting and blame shifting, right?
Hmm.
Finding other people to accuse of their problems. But once we start to get them into our brain, health treatment programs, and they start to recover, they do start to get better. But a lot of them have metabolic syndrome, right? Because of the systemic damage that has happened. Many of them end up having comorbidities with diabetes, with heart disease, with stroke. And it has been really interesting to see how adding GLP-1 receptor activators has helped to quiet down the drink chatter or the drug chatter in their brain as well. And some of that more juvenile idealization of the times that they got drunk and got high.
You think about it I'm sorry, in another way that I talk to them about it is once you've become addicted, and we use that word, or substance dependent, you can be physiologically dependent on a substance and not addicted, meaning you don't sell the children to get a drug. You just have pain or you have some reason for it. That's not what I'm talking about. But their life has become so compromised in so many areas. They're not doing well in almost everything. They feel bad about themselves. And because of what drug does to what we call the tone and the reward, they don't have reward from anything else in their life but the drug. And so you take the one thing away from them that gives them some temporary respite or pleasure from the anxiety and the stress that's really inherent with addiction. They're going to fight hard because you're taking away the thing that makes them feel good. I always, it's a 2 to 4 hour vacation from all that, and you're going to take that from me, and it's not going to get really good for about 4 or 5 months. That's like telling a 5-year-old it's 6 months to Christmas. You might as well cancel it. They can't envision waiting that long, but that's what addicts are like.
Yeah.
They really are. You're going to take away my food, my only sense of enjoyment, entertainment. I use the analogy of we've replaced your high definition 65-inch colored TV, and we're going to give you a 12-inch black and white for 8 months. Want to do that? No, but that's what happens to their brain, is that they see the world as not a pleasant, happy place anymore. It is when they get high. The color comes on for a while. And when families understand that, and we call that anhedonia, the inability to feel joy. And that's what reward deficiency syndrome is. It isn't just because you made bad choices, it's because you don't have the chemistry available, dopamine deficiency, serotonin deficiency. You don't have that stuff to make you feel good at a level, a steady level. Their life goes like this: high, depressed, and that's how they live. And it kills families. It kills careers. It's an awful way to live.
I think that's a great segue into another trend that we're seeing quite a bit of these days, which is parental rejection by children. When you talk about killing of families, and I honestly don't know how much of this is tied up with substance abuse, how much of it is cultural, but we've got a couple of families that come to mind right off the top of my head where there's a child who's developed a very strong sense of resentment and opposition and hatred towards a parent who seems like a loving, caring parent. And this is not, of course, many families have pathology and there are plenty of abusive and horrible parents out there. But even in normal families, we're starting to see this now, where at least normal parents are loving and caring, have provided a great environment, enriched environment for their child to thrive in. And something has happened either culturally or through peer groups or through other mechanisms, where the child has developed a horrific opinion of the parent and then rejects them. And this is causing a lot of pain and suffering for parents.
Yeah, it really is.
What kind of insights can you provide our audience about that issue?
It's not understood very well. I have a theory. One theory. This is going to be a multifaceted probably issue here, but we have a generation that has been entertained 24/7 their whole life. There's always something entertaining going on. Their cell phone, the computer, the TV. It's a fast-paced thing, and say, hey, you want to go spend half a day with your mom and dad? Have dinner together as a family. To a lot of people in this generation, that sounds like watching paint dry. It's black and white TV. Right. I think that's a variable, I think, or one of the things that happens in some of it isn't the animosity you've talked about. Some of it is just indifference. They're just indifference. They don't understand their parents miss them. I've
Mhm.
told mine, they're adults. I said, I still want to pick you up and hold you like you're
That's right.
3.
That's
That
right.
never goes away from us. You won't
Yeah.
let us do that anymore,
No.
but we still want to do that.
Yeah.
You grow another heart for each kid you have, and you never
Yeah.
knew you could love something so much. So it's devastating to parents. But I think we train them to be independent, self-sufficient people. And then we want them to,
That's
we
right.
want them we want them to need us again. Daddy, would you tie my shoe? Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Remember my
Yeah.
daughter coming in and said, "Draw me a kitty, Daddy." Oh, that was the
Yeah.
best years, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't
They were.
I don't know what's happening with this. Part of it is the divorce culture. Part of it is that. I don't know. There's a lot of things going on. I think we have to look at.
When I try to look at the neurobiology, and there are actually evolutionary psychologists out there that talk about the importance of community and how our
Mhm.
brains uh, over many years have adapted to embrace the importance of community, especially when survival really depended on it.
Yes.
To be outcast from the tribe was a recipe for death. And so we would do all sorts of we would, cultures that really prize a family community have mechanisms built in to repair damage when it happens in a
Hmm.
relationship, to avoid relationship damage in the first place, to bond with each other, to engage in shared experiences, to have shared goals that people can work together for. And a lot of
Hmm.
that, if you go to the neurobiology of it, really involves the salience network and
Yes.
traits like empathy, compassion, which is the empathy in action, really, the virtuous application of empathy. Um, and we are hardwired, as you've said many times, to be in community with one another.
I,
And I think one of the sadder aspects of the neuroeconomy that we're in here is that a lot of that community can be replaced by connection through other network mechanisms,
like
right?
what we're
The
doing
internet.
right now, right?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, you may be, 10 feet away from me in the next room, but we're communicating through electronic media, right? And
Yeah.
so, uh, you know, how much of artificial intelligence is going to turn up the dial on that when you have avatars that can act so close to the ideal human, right? That you don't have to do the hard work of going out and establishing a connection with somebody else. It can be spoon-fed to you.
Yeah. I think you're on. I think I remember the paper 20 years ago was all this blue ribbon committee of all the experts in the fields, and it said we are hardwired to connect, and it was a
Mhm.
scientific white paper, and it was. I still have it. I think it's still true, but our culture has changed so dramatically due to the things you just talked about. Um, and I think of pornography addiction, for example.
Mhm.
There are I don't know the percentage, but there are men now who prefer pornography to the real thing
Mhm.
because it's shot in a way that looking at a Playboy magazine in the 70s, you never thought it was real. It was a picture with staples in it. You knew you were holding. It's shot now so you don't watch it, you participate in it. Those
Mhm.
mirror neurons in our brain do a lot of things, but that's why it's a good movie. You can get scared and cry because you're
Mhm.
participating in
Mhm.
what you're seeing on an inanimate object, right? Part of that is going on as well, where we're making artificial communities and a lot of movies about artificial intelligent companions.
Mhm.
That scares me, Dr. Orr,
Mhm.
because I can see that happening. I'm not trying to be dystopian, but well, I am, I guess. I guess.
Well, it's hard
But
not to be dystopian these days. I saw some statistics recently that 11% of people in our country don't have any friends. That was really shocking to me. If you had asked me what was my best guess, I might have said maybe 1% at the high end, probably more like 0.5%. So more than one
mhm.
in 10 people in this country has zero friends. which I find just really sad
I'll
and
think of the deaths of
disheartening.
despair we talked about last couple of years ago.
Yeah,
The suicide by more affluent white males who are alone.
yeah,
Those people kill themselves, and they have
yeah,
all the money in the world. But I think we didn't have parental alienation. We weren't talking about it then, but I'm sure that's part of what was going on there.
yeah. I
In
think
the
you're right about that.
1970s, I read a paper. He's now the chairman of psychiatry here, but he wrote a paper and he compared depression rates in 19 hospitalization for psychiatric disorder in 1970 through for teenagers to 1990. In
Hmm.
1970, there was like 2,000 people, kids admitted to hospital in 1 year in the United States. In
Hmm.
1970, it was 300,000 kids.
Hmm.
And I said, was it a virus? What happened? And then you look at what happened in family. We went to no fault divorce. People don't even remember divorce used to be decided by a judge.
Hmm.
You go to court, there was fault. And the judge normally, if you had children, almost always said, I order you to go to marital counseling and come back and see me in 6 months. And about 70% of the marriages were saved.
Hmm.
And children have grown up, and I read this probably 5 years ago, of the ones who leave suicide notes. One of the top 5 items is my parents, I miss my dad.
Hmm.
My I miss my dad. And that's politically incorrect to say it, but children are growing up without a father. And I think all
Hmm.
these things are conspiring. Think of families 50, 100 years ago. In my neighborhood, I got whooped by the neighbor lady as much as I got spanked by my mother, and she had permission to do that, right? I was picking apples off her tree, and she'd swat me and send me home, and then my mother would swat me and send me back to apologize. And your grandparents and your aunts and uncles and cousins were all around you. So if you were fighting with family members, you could go to a grandfather or you could go to a cousin, or you had this family structure that doesn't exist anymore. It's
Hmm.
being supplanted by this artificial kinds of things.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a factor that we have to look at. What's happened to the connections? What's happened to our families? And how important we can't live without friends and family. I don't think we can exist very long without that.
I saw a 30-year-old patient in clinic yesterday who came in because of tremors. And, on the surface, it seemed like it was a fairly simple complaint. But after spending an hour with him, it became clear that this unfortunate young man, he had had a lot of health challenges in his adolescent years and an inflammatory bowel problem that caused malabsorption of nutrients that was affecting his nervous system. And nobody had really quite put their finger on it. And fortunately, this guy has a good set of parents who are willing to support him at home, an ambitious older brother and younger sister who are very successful. And at the age of 30, he was not even depressed or despondent. He was just resigned to the fact that he was never going to have a good life,
Mm,
and he's one of those 11% probably that has no friends, and spends all of his day consuming content on YouTube or TV with zero ambition to do anything in life, no sense of purpose.
wow.
And my question to him is, if you didn't have such a supportive family, and obviously they want him to be healthy and they want him to succeed and go get a job and find love and have children and all of that. But I said, if you didn't have this supportive family and you found yourself on the streets, what would you do? And he didn't even have a starting place. It was
No.
not even I would go to a homeless shelter or I would beg for food. It was like, I don't know. He couldn't even give me, he was so resigned. And it really just broke my heart for him to see that he had gotten to this place. Now I'm really optimistic that we're going to be able to fix that because I think a lot of what he's dealing with is the effects of chronic vitamin B12 deficiency because of malabsorption. So that should be a pretty easy fix, and hopefully within a couple months he'll be feeling much better. But I think I kind of get the sense that yes, we're dealing with a lot of cultural changes, and I totally hear what you're saying about no fault divorce and families being torn apart culturally. And then we also have this neurobiological disaster zone that we're living in
Yeah,
because of
both.
toxins in the environment, and
Absolutely.
um, and so it's we got a lot of work to do to change our environment for the better. That's for sure. But
Yeah, the environment
yeah,
alone, I mean, it's a factor, and as we've learned in our work with thousands of people we've seen over our careers, it's a combination of lots of things. And
yeah,
unfortunately, in the managed care system, you get 5 minutes to see your neurologist after you've had an appointment for 3 months, and
yeah,
it's not attending to those biological needs at all. So
yeah.
it's really people who, healthcare insurance is great until you get sick,
That's
you
right.
know, and then there's no one 5 minutes to tell you my story. And what I love about our practice is we'll spend an hour and a half the first visit
Mhm.
letting them tell their story. And we
Yeah,
learn so much just by listening to them. And
yeah,
they always stop us and say, "Well, I'm sorry, I'll make a long story short." And we say, "No, make the long story long."
yeah.
And they've never experienced two doctors sitting in a room listening to them for an hour,
Speak
and
freely. Yeah,
they feel connected. And I think that's one of the when we opted out of the other system, I think it's been a real blessing to our patients that they know we're there, and we're going to listen, and we care that they're
yeah.
hurt, and we want them not to. And that's what medicine used to be a long time ago.
Hmm.
I remember house calls. That's I'm old enough when Lincoln was president. I think that was older than dirt,
That's
but
funny.
that's a good point. And it always is we look at the plague, and it was both the bacteria, but how it was transmitted was environmental changes. We
Hmm.
moved from our clans alone into community, into kingdoms where the rats went, and so disease could spread more readily because of we always had the bacteria, we always had the rats, we always had the fleas. We just didn't have all
Hmm.
the people in close proximity, and it
Hmm.
killed half of Europe.
Yeah,
So yeah, all those things are important. So, and then we look at the epidemic of drugs. I think we have to look at all those things,
yeah,
right? You know,
yeah.
all
I mean,
those things.
it's maybe the modern day plague. We've got a lot of people crowded
Yeah,
into small spaces, and maybe even crowding into social media spaces now in ways that are causing interactions that are causing digital viruses, if you will, digital thought malfunctions that maybe we all just need a little more space from each other in
and the
those areas.
expectation of immediacy and rewards.
Yeah.
I've heard one kid said, instant gratification takes way too long.
Well, this has
Um,
been a great discussion, Dr. Edwards.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Orr.
And so we're very grateful for the comments, the feedback we got from our last Braincast, and set us up to have this talk. And what we would really love is if those of you who are watching disagree with us, please tell us how we got it wrong. If you like what we're saying, please go ahead and let us know. And topics and ideas for future discussion. Uh, Please don't hesitate to drop some comments below, and it would
And
really
we were
help our
very
channel
general
out.
today. I think if there's something
Yeah,
you want us to talk more about, because we just kind of did an overview of a lot of
yeah,
things today, but we're good at deep dives. We're happy to
yeah.
do that. So please, just honest feedback would be very helpful.
Yeah, maybe in our next Braincast we can get into this GLP-1 receptor activators a little bit more. There's some really exciting
Yeah,
products on the horizon, like retatrutide, for example, which they're calling GLP-3 because it activates three different receptors, and even beyond that, there's some more in the pipeline down the road. So,
it's
um,
truly a game changer. It
yeah,
really is. And it's not just to lose weight. There's particularly tirzepatide is really helping the brain in a lot of ways we didn't know before. And
yeah,
we were alluding to that. And I think that's going to be a really important drug in our work.
yeah. Well, I think maybe next time we'll kind of talk about how we're folding that into our clinical practice. So for those of you who like this, please, it would really help our channel if you like the content today and subscribe and turn on the bell so that you can get notified when we drop our next content. You can also find us on Instagram and on TikTok and the other major platforms. And for anybody who is interested in becoming a patient, we'll have our contact information. You can submit a form to apply. If you'd like to see one or both of us in our clinical practice, we're taking on new patients and clients now. So thanks very much, everybody. We'll see you in the next one.
All right. Thank you, guys.